We have it pictured here on the front page. The brain and spinal cord, which are very tiny in Mr. Homer here. And so we're going to be actually talking about mainly the brain in this lecture. Probably the first 10 or so slides we're going to talk about the spinal cord. We're going to talk a little bit more about the spinal cord in the next lecture, but that's not to say we won't talk about the brain in that lecture too. So we kind of do a little bit of hodgepodging all over the place. The first slide here is a complete review of what we talked about the other day, which is those parts of our brain and spinal cord we classify as gray and white matter. We learned last time that gray matter gets its appearance as gray. It is dull colored because of a lack of myelin. It also appears gray because of the Nissl bodies. Nissl bodies is just a fancy way to describe the RER that's found in the cell bodies of neurons. This is described as the site of synaptic contact between neurons. Therefore, we can describe it as the site of synaptic integration or information processing in our central nervous system. What we mean by synaptic contact is what we talked about last time, where the end of a neuron meets the beginning of a new neuron. Okay, where the release of neurotransmitters takes place, which is what we talked about at the very end of the last time. Okay, we find the cell bodies of motor and interneurons within the gray matter. Okay. And so I kind of circled here two different neurons, the axon terminals of the first neuron, the cell body and dendrites of the second neuron. Okay. White matter, we said last time, is bright white in appearance, getting its appearance due to the abundance of myelin. We describe this as generally long bundles of axons in our brain and spinal cord we collectively call tracts. Now, it says here, carrying signals up and down the spinal cord, or up or down. We also have tracts in our brain, but we spend an entire specific slide talking about those tracts. There are tracts that go up and down the brain, front to back of the brain, and cross over from right to left in our cerebrum. So we'll talk about those three different types of tracts in our cerebrum towards the end of this lecture. The two types of tracts in our brain, or in our spinal cord, though, are called sensory or ascending, motor, and descending. We'll talk about what that means here in a little bit. Let's look at the gray matter in a little bit greater detail here. In our spinal cord, it forms an interior H shape, and I've listed out the different parts of that, which is anatomy-based stuff, but it does play a big part of function. We have what we call four horns to our gray matter. Two dorsal horns. Dorsal is the word that also means, or is a word that could also be described as posterior. Posterior and dorsal are synonyms. I think in the figure in a couple slides it says posterior instead of dorsal. Posterior and dorsal mean the same thing. That helps right next to dorsal, put posterior. Ventral and anterior mean the same thing. Okay. These two function differently. Let me show you a picture of a spinal cord and what I mean by that. Here we have a picture of a spinal cord segment. Here's our inner H, and we've got two posterior horns. This one is only showing the horn by itself. Here we're showing neurons coming into it. The posterior or dorsal horn of gray matter is always going to be where sensory neurons come in. So we say that it receives impulses from afferent or sensory neurons. So when you feel itch or a tickle or pain or pressure coming from your skin, it's going to end up going to the backside of your spinal cord. Okay. Remember that most sensory neurons are unipolar in structure, right? These little dots here are off to the side. Those dots are the cell bodies. Off to the side, and we talked about that last time. So they come into the spinal cord, and then they're going to synapse with maybe an interneuron, like we show here in purple. And maybe that signal is going to go down that motor or that interneuron directly to a motor neuron. which the cell bodies of motor neurons are located in the anterior horn or ventral horn, which carries that signal out and to skeletal muscle if it's a somatic motor neuron, because we know the somatic nervous system is involved with voluntary control of skeletal muscle. Sometimes, though, we carry the signal from the dorsal or posterior horn across by way of what we call the gray commissure. This is the crossbar of our H. And we run it over to the white matter on the other side of the spinal cord. Or maybe it goes directly into the white matter of the same side of the spinal cord. So we have all sorts of different options that can occur. Okay? So we've got 2 posterior and 2 anterior horns. In this segment of the spinal cord, we'll also find 2 lateral horns. Now, these lateral horns are only present between T1 and L1 vertebrae, which is basically the middle and towards the bottom of our chest and body, or our trunk. Right about here is what we could think of it. Okay. These contain the cell bodies of autonomic motor neurons. Now, what was the word that described the function of the autonomic nervous system? Automatic, which is the system that controls things like cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and our glands. Okay? Think about the organs that are located in this part of our body. How many of those are controlled automatically? How about all of them? For the most part, right? Okay. Our heart, our lungs, our liver, stomach, intestines, pancreas, gallbladder, spleen, all sorts of organs right in there. How nice is it that we've got signals coming directly from the spinal cord right there to them? Okay. That's not to say that signals from our brain don't come down to control those things, because we have a special cranial nerve that we're going to talk about that comes all the way from our brain down into our abdomen, which means it runs down through our head, neck, chest, through the diaphragm, and then downward. So that's something that we'll talk about at the end of this lecture. At the center of, and it's not labeled, the gray commissure, is the central canal. This is a cavity where cerebrospinal fluid circulates. We'll talk about cerebrospinal fluid, and we've already talked about it a little bit later. Okay. So that's the gray matter in the spinal cord. It's a little more complex in structure than what we kind of described the gray matter in the brain. Although the brain gray matter is pretty complex. And that is important, really, really important actually, because this is where your really high level brain power comes from. Specifically your cerebral cortex, which you guys are using right now to listen to me and see the words on this page. So voluntarily control your pencils by way of muscle contractions. So the cortex is the outer thin shell of gray matter in our cerebrum. We've also got a cerebellar cortex, which is a thin shell of gray matter in our cerebellum. The cerebellum and the cerebrum are the 2 largest structures in our brain. And they also have white matter. Now, the white matter in our spinal cord is on the outside of that inner gray matter, and collectively we will describe the tracts here in a second, which we classify as ascending and descending, or sensory and motor. In our cerebrum and our cerebellum, it's deep to that outer cortex, which you can see is on the outside. And we showed this the other day. Okay. And we'll talk about the tracts that carry signals up and down our brain, front to back of our brain, and crossing from one side to the other in our brain. So that's pretty cool. Tracts in our brain are very important, just like tracts in our spinal cord. The organization of the gray matter in our specific, really namely the spinal cord, allow it to function as a reflex arc, which means that signals can come in to the backside. We can process that and send the signal right back out, actually, that causes us to respond. Okay, I've talked all semester about touching a hot stove and removing your hand from it, right? Well, touching that hot stove is going to stimulate sensor receptors in our skin that carry that painful stimulus into the back of our spinal cord. Now, it's important that we get our hand off that hot stove immediately, right? So instead of having to carry the signal up to our brain by sensory tracts, we can use a spinal reflex, which allows this neuron, an interneuron here, to process it, decide what we need to do, which is to get our hand off that hot stove, which allows it to stimulate skeletal muscles that contract to get our hand off of it. Okay, we're going to talk about the flexor withdrawal reflex, which is what I just talked about. Okay, flexing muscles to withdraw from a painful stimulus. We also will talk about the knee-jerk reflex, which is what happens when you tap on that patellar tendon and your leg kicks out. Those are both examples of spinal reflexes, where the reflex arcs, comes in and arcs right back out. Okay. We'll also talk about cranial reflexes, which use the brain. And a lot of times that involves signals coming down from the brain or signals that control things automatically, okay, through our autonomic nervous system. It'll be towards the end of the next lecture. We won't really talk too much about reflexes in this lecture. Okay. Now, it's important to understand, and you can see that with the image there that I was just on, that the gray matter and the white matter are not independent of one another. They're associated with one another. Signals can leave the gray matter and enter the white matter, and vice versa. Speaking of the white matter, in our spinal cord, we said that the white matter forms two types of tracts, ascending and descending. And the ascending or sensory are like an elevator carrying somebody up. And so somebody, it's an impulse and up is towards the brain. Versus a motor or descending is like carrying someone down the elevator, shown down here in red, carrying the signal down from the brain. Okay. So blue here is ascending, or sensory motor descending is in red. We name tracts for their location in the white matter and where they begin and end. Generally what their name describes. As we just said, the white matter contains both sensory and motor tracts. Now this is what we're talking about, specifically the spinal cord. We'll get to the tracts of the brain later, like I said. So nerve impulses from sensory receptors can propagate up the spinal cord to the brain along two main routes on each side, what we call the spinothalamic tract and posterior column. Now, the spinothalamic tract is the division or part of the white matter that conducts impulses upwards for sensing pain, warmth, coolness, itching, and tickling. Those are all examples of general senses, okay, which means that they're not classified as the special senses like vision, hearing, taste, smell, that kind of stuff. The posterior column actually consists of two tracts. I'm not worried about those, but I do want you to know what the posterior column does, and that conveys impulses for touch, pressure, vibration, and conscious proprioception, which is a fancy way to describe basically our body's awareness of itself in space, so the position and movements of muscles, tendons, and joints. Those are all examples, both from the spinothalamic tract and the posterior column, general senses. And we'll talk more about these things in our next unit, where we talk about the general senses and special senses in a singular lecture. Those are shown here on this next page in these blue shaded regions. I'm not worried about that. Okay. I also included some stuff here on the motor tracts, or descending tracts, which are shown here on the other side in red. Now, I mentioned we'd talk more about the cerebrum and the later parts of this lecture, but the cerebral cortex does affect the function of these motor tracts because our cerebral cortex, which is the outer part of our brain, is the major controlling center of our precise voluntary muscle contractions. Like me waving at you guys right now with my right hand, I'm voluntarily doing that, and that is all traced back to signals from that very outer layer of gray matter in my cerebrum. So that's for voluntary. Other brain regions, especially down in the brainstem, provide integration for regulating our autonomic. Once again, autonomic can be said as automatic. So that signaling to places like your heart and your muscles in your organs come from other brain regions. As far as output to our skeletal muscles, it will travel down the spinal cord in two types of descending pathways, direct and indirect. The direct pathway, I'm not concerned about the names of those different tracks. What I do want you to know is they convey impulses originating in the cortex, destined to cause, and the key here is voluntary movements of our skeletal muscles. We have direct control, if that helps you think of it that way. Now, when we describe skeletal muscle, I've said that it is voluntarily controlled, right? There is still some involuntary action of our skeletal muscles, which is automatically done for us. And that is provided to us by the indirect pathway. It includes several tracks that I'm not really worried about. But they control impulses, or convey impulses, from the brainstem, causing automatic or involuntary movements, doing things like regulating muscle tone, posture, balance, orientation of our head and body. A lot of people don't know this, but when you feel like your muscles are in a complete relaxed state, you're completely wrong. Okay? There's always a slight degree of tension in your muscles. That's provided to us by this thing called muscle tone. That's what muscle tone is. Just very weak, tiny contractions. Now, and this is the case unless you have paralysis. In that case, your muscles become completely flaccid, means that there's no way to stimulate them whatsoever because they've basically been cut off from nervous innervation. Okay, so that's what muscle tone is. Even when our muscles are feeling like they're relaxed, they are slightly contracted. And the posture, balance, and orientation of the head and body just kind of help keep us aligned and upright and that kind of stuff, which is automatically done for us, which is very, very nice. And that's what tracks in our spinal cord do. That's it for this lecture on the spinal cord. Like I said, we will talk more about the spinal cord in our next lecture, so we'll get to that next week, hopefully on Monday. What we're going to do now is talk about the brain, and we're going to go through the parts of the brain and learn about what they do. But first I want to talk about feeding the brain and allowing it to function as a whole. Feeding the brain involves blood flow, and a lot of it. Even though our brain only represents about 2% of our body weight, it consumes about 20% of our oxygen and glucose at rest. Significant amount. Why? Well, because it needs a very dense supply of ATP. And it only makes ATP by way of reactions that use oxygen. What do we use that word? What word is it that describes the use of oxygen to make ATP? Starts with an A, ends in aerobic. Aerobic, not anaerobic. Aerobic respiration is this process. It explains why you can't go very long without oxygen or blood flow to your brain. If you cut off that flow blood to your brain, guess what's going to happen to you? You're going to first pass out, and if that doesn't fix things, you're going to die. A few minutes for most people. When activity of our neurons and neuroglia increase in the region of the brain, blood flow to that area also increases. Makes sense. And that's something that doctors and scientists have utilized to um, kind of figure out what parts of the brain do what. So very cool how that worked. Because virtually no glucose is stored in the brain, and the reaction used to make ATP from glucose, supply of glucose and oxygen to the brain must be continuous, like I was just saying. Blood low in glucose entering the brain can cause mental confusion, dizziness, convulsions, and even possible loss of consciousness. It can be very scary, and that happens a lot in what we call hypoglycemic states when your blood sugar is real low. Very dangerous for people with like diabetes, where they can get really hypoglycemic. Blood-brain barrier we talked about last time, created by astrocytes that wrap around the blood vessels that feed our heart, feed our brain and spinal cord. They protect brain cells from harmful substances and pathogens by preventing the passage of them from our blood and into our brain tissue. I talked about this just the other day. Now, some things can pass through this blood-brain barrier. Few water-soluble substances like glucose can cross it by active transport. You guys remember what active transport means? It needs ATP, right? Other substances like creatinine, urea, those are two waste products that actually probably will leave the brain. Most ions will cross it very slowly. Lipid-soluble substances like O2, CO2, alcohol, and anesthetic agents will easily cross it. Explains why alcohol and anesthesia can really affect brain power. They can really get in there. Same thing for your spinal cord. Okay. Proteins and most antibiotic drugs do not pass through it whatsoever, which is great for various reasons. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about before we actually get into the parts of the brain is the cerebrospinal fluid. Stuff that we talked about last time, we've talked about actually since the beginning of the semester. The clear, colorless liquid that our epidermal cells produces. We learned that last time. We produce this in both our brain and spinal cord and circulate it, protecting all our brain and spinal cord from chemical and physical injuries. Also carries oxygen, glucose, and other needed chemicals from our blood to neurons and neuroglia. And think of it like a flowing river in that it always is circulating through what we call ventricles in our brain, cavities, where the cerebrospinal fluid is found, and then that central canal, that little tiny opening in the middle of that gray matter of our spinal cord. Total volume of it's actually pretty small, 80 to 150 mils or 3 to 5 ounces. Just think like a pop can, which is 12 ounces. It's not even half of that, so just a little bit of it. Contains glucose, proteins, lactic acid, urea, a lot of cations. We talked all about sodium and potassium the other day. Calcium, we learned that's involved in synapses. Calcium has to come into the knob, trigger the movement of those vesicles to release the neurotransmitters. So we talked all about the importance of those in our neurons or around our neurons. And then anions, we talked about chloride as something that can inhibit a neuron. And then bicarb, we haven't talked really about it too much, but will later in the semester, not too much here. Magnesium, we didn't really talk about, probably won't talk about. There's also some white blood cells in our cerebrospinal fluid, providing us with various immune functions. Overall, that chemical contributes to homeostasis 3 ways. It provides mechanical and chemical protection, and then helps to circulate those nutrients and waste that we were just talking about. How it protects us mechanically, basically within our cranial cavity and our spinal cavity, the brain and spinal cord are going to float in this fluid. Prevents jolts that can cause them to hit the bony walls of the cranial cavity, vertebral cavity, which is not 100% preventable, which is why a lot of times when you have a sudden jolt, you can get a concussion. There are such things as both cerebral or brain concussions, but also spinal concussions. Basically, it's a bruised brain or spinal cord. You hear a lot about those in sports today because of, what negative effects they can do in long terms. causing things like CTE that is really kind of becoming much more well known. Chemical protection provides an optimal chemical environment for accurate neuronal signaling by basically having the correct amount of sodium, potassium, chloride, that stuff that we talked about last time. If there's a slight change in those ionic compositions, action potential production can be seriously disrupted. And then I kind of already talked about circulation and moving nutrients and waste back and forth. For most of this lecture remaining, we are going to go part of brain by part of brain, learning about what they do. Our brain stem is one of our divisions. It helps to regulate internal bodily functions and involuntary reflexes. It is located just above our spinal cord. We can see here on the next page. Some of our most basic functions take place in our brain stem. It includes the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain. Now I had the cerebellum listed there under brain stem. It's actually not part of it. You can see it's like right next to it. This is part of what we call the hindbrain. It's the second largest part of our brain, second in size to the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the major part of the telencephalon. Along with the diencephalon, those two things form the forebrain, which is where our highest level thinking and nervous functions come from. Perceptions, so being aware of sensory stimuli, voluntary motor control, so like voluntarily moving muscles, emotions, cognition, and language. Okay. Like I said, the cerebrum is the largest structure. It's part of the telencephalon. And then you got the three thalamuses, hypo, epi, and then just regular thalamus. Those are part of the diencephalon, and they're located like right there, just above the brainstem and below the cerebrum. I'm not really worried about locations and that kind of stuff because we're gonna not focus on that as much as function because that's what we study in this class. But I want to throw the picture in there just so you can kind of orient yourself on these various things. We're going to work ourselves up from the bottom, which begins with the medulla that sits right on top of our brainstem. This is a very important function for autonomic purposes, controlling a lot of automatic things in our body. So we've got 4 bullets here, and there's actually a little bit of information here on the next slide about the medulla. Notice that nowhere in here it talks about alligators being ornery. So if you've ever seen that movie, The Water Boy, it's not what we're talking about. Within the medulla are nuclei. The word nuclei in this case, and in the case of anything in our brain, we're talking about several cell bodies of neurons. Remember, the cell body is where the nucleus is, so that's probably where the name neuron or nuclei come from. So there's several nuclei that are components of sensory pathways for gestation, which is a fancy way for taste, audition, fancy word for hearing, equilibrium, fancy word for balance. So 3 of our special senses associated with the medulla. It also contains nuclei associated with some of our general senses, touch, pressure, vibration, and then that conscious proprioception we were talking about earlier. Attached to our medulla are cranial nerves 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12, so our last 5 pairs attached to the medulla. We'll learn about what each one of these does at the end of this lecture. Of the ones that we talked about in this class, number 10 is by far the most prominent. Actually, both of them, because there's 2. Each of these is in pairs. Okay. The last 4 things here listed, the primitive, visceral, and somatic functions, really kind of the meat and potatoes of what the medulla does. We can describe it as our cardiac center and our vasomotor center. Combine those, you have the cardiovascular center. So our medulla regulates our cardiovascular system, which includes our blood, heart, and blood vessels. Well, our blood is found within our heart and our blood vessels, and our heart is controlled by what we call the cardiac center. And I'm talking heart rate, so how fast and how hard our heart beats. The vasomotor center refers to the blood vessels. And the vasomotor center of our medulla regulates the diameter of our blood vessels, which does two things. Regulates blood pressure and regulates where blood is going. So it can route blood to where it needs to be and shut it off from where it doesn't need to be. We'll talk about these things in greater detail when we get to the cardiovascular system. Medulla has what's called the medullary rhythmicity area. If you take the RY off of the word medullary, what word do you have? Medulla. Okay. So this is the part of the medulla that helps with breathing. Okay. It adjusts the rhythm in which we breathe. Think about exercising. We breathe faster, our heart beats harder, our blood pressure changes. So the medulla is involved in the fight or flight response, so we're just exercising as a whole, very, very much so. Last thing there, it's involved in reflexes for vomiting, swallowing, sneezing, coughing, and hiccuping, all automatically done for us. For the most part, anyway. Last thing I want to talk about with the medulla are these things called pyramids, which are shown in the image at the bottom. These are anterior bulges of the medulla formed by the corticospinal tracts from the cerebrum down into the spinal cord. We just talked about the corticospinal tracts, but they are the ones that control voluntary movement of limbs and trunk. If you look down here where it says the word decussation, you can see it kind of forms an X because the tracts are actually crossing from one side to the other. This is not just descending, but also ascending, so sensory and motor. The word decussation refers to crossing over of those signals, which explains why, if I were to raise my right hand, you would describe that as my left brain controlling it. Okay, about 90% of the axons perform this. The last structure I want to talk about real quick, it's not long to talk about it, is our pons. Pons can be basically described as a bridge. It sits above our medulla, and we call it a bridge because it connects different parts of the brain with one another. It has white matter that includes tracts conducting signals from the cerebrum down to the cerebellum and medulla, tracts that carry signals up to the thalamus. Within the pons are nuclei, sensory tracts, and motor tracts. Associated with it are cranial nerves 5, 6, 7, and 8. The second bullet is probably the most important thing that it does. Along with that medulla, it helps control our breathing rate and how deep we breathe, that kind of stuff. So we'll talk about these things later in the semester. The parts of it that do so are called the pneumotaxic and apneustic areas. It's also involved with equilibrium from our inner ears to the brain. Equilibrium is balance. And then signals for voluntary movements from motor areas in the cerebral cortex are relayed through the nuclei here to the cerebellum. We'll pick up with the midbrain on Monday.